and reserve further introduction to this event for its moderator and convener, Eric Davis. So Eric, take it away.
Great. Hey, thanks for everyone showing up. It's kind of fun to start off early. My name's Eric Davis. I'm a PhD independent scholar, though I'm teaching a class at Pacific Graduate Institute right now on the Trickster. It's pretty fun. I'm the author of this book. I'm going to do a lot of book show and tell right here. High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoteric, and Visionary Experience in the 70s. So the topic of this panel is very close to my heart, and the topic being dark psychedelia. So right now, psychedelia is having a day in the sun. It's very hyped. There's a lot of clinical research. There's a lot of popular culture rewriting of the narrative of psychedelics within Euro-America, as well as in indigenous areas. And one thing that is decidedly not emphasized is what we could call the dark side of the force. That is either people actively encouraging and exploring the dark side through psychedelics, or at least acknowledging the twisted and excessive domains therein. I'll say a little bit more about the topic to introduce it. I guess I'll lay out how we're going to do this today. We're going to have brief presentations, kind of introductions of prompts, probes from all of our speakers. So the first half will be roughly sort of panelish, although we'll be chatting just among ourselves in between each brief presentation, and I'll introduce our presenters in a moment. You're welcome to use the chat during this feature. Particularly, you can throw questions if you have specific questions on presentations. I'll be reading the chat, maybe I'll introduce them. And then towards the end of the panel, we'll open it up and invite people to come right in and unmute themselves and show their camera if they want to ask questions. So I'll ask you to raise your hand in the participant function, I believe, is what allows you to get to that. You guys are probably all familiar with this. So that's the rough outline of our hour and a half. I want to introduce the other speakers at the moment, and then when they come on, we don't have to stop and do that. We'll first be hearing from Dr. Amy Hale, who's an Atlanta-based anthropologist and folklorist, writes about esoteric history, art, culture, women, and Cornwall in various combinations. One of these combinations is her awesome new book on Ithel Colquhoun. I think I pronounced it correctly, those wacky Welsh, and Cornish. And it's a wonderful book on visionary art and a particularly fascinating esoteric story. I'm also really looking forward to, I just found out that she's editing a forthcoming collection called Essays on Women in Western Esotericism, Beyond Seeresses and Sea Priestesses, which is a bit of a tongue twister, so you got to say it real fast. Next up, we're going to be hearing from James Riley, who's the Muriel Bradbrook Official Fellow of English Literature at Girton College, also a bit of a tongue twister, at the University of Cambridge. He's the author of The Bad Trip, New Worlds, Dark Omens, and the End of the 60s. Our panelist, Christian Greer, is holding up this marvel, which I have not read, though I have read enough to know that I must. You know that category of book. So he also has a book coming out on William Burroughs entitled Playback Hex. He's written for a lot of periodicals and has published book chapters on the fiction of the 60s, ghosts, psychedelia, and contemporary protest, all fascinating topics, a man after my own heart. And finally, the legendary Christian Greer. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University. And he's coordinating the popular Psychedelics and the Future of Religion lecture series, which has absorbed me into its matrix. I think in April, I'll be giving a talk there. His research focuses on the religious dimension of psychedelic culture and Western esotericism in general. And I am one of the rare few who's a proud owner of the dissertation edition of Angel-Headed Hipsters, Psychedelic Militancy in the 1980s North America. We'll be hearing more about the 1980s. Nobody talks about 1980s psychedelia, so Christian's your man. So what I want to do with just a few minutes is to kind of set the stage. one of the interesting things about psychedelics is this core message of set and setting, meaning that the attitudes, expectations, and intentions that the individual has going into a situation have an active creative force on the nature of their experiences. It's like a kind of social constructionism feedback loop, but far more intense and far more noticeable. This means that the stories that we tell about psychedelics personally and also culturally have an active role to play in the actual phenomenology of people's experiences. This means we have extra reason to look at what are those cultural influences that, say, the first popular wave of psychedelicists were diving into in, let's say, the early 1960s, after a roughly 10 to 15 year period of more elite use of LSD and mescaline. And of course, peyote was already being used by underground artists as early as the 1940s, to say nothing about all the various indigenous currents that run into this. But where we're really taking off here is in the 50s, 60s. And the one role that I want to say, as we're looking at what are these cultural frames, what are these cultural stories that are creating the ambiance, the set and setting for this young wave of trippers. And one I think is really important to emphasize is weird fiction, which had a huge boom in the early 1960s as the new wave of paperback publishers came on and said, hey, we gotta take advantage of this market. We're making cheap books. And the paperback revolution, the post-war paperback revolution, is a really fascinating part of American history. Just one note to say is that it opened up both the high and the low, because publishers were seeking to put out material, so they republished lots of classics. So suddenly you had classics with lurid covers, and they were cheap on pulp paper, which meant everybody could read them. Come on in, go ahead. You too can read Zola. And at the same time, it allowed a space for a whole kind of pulp phantasmagoria to flourish. So I just want to go over that a little bit. So some of the early 60s paperback outfits that specialized in dark fantasy were, here's an example. This is an Ace edition of The King in Yellow, a very key text, pre-Lovecraftian dark supernatural horror. This is a Belmont edition. This Frank Belmont Long was another one of the Weird Tales guys, along with Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard. This actually contains a drug story called The Hounds of Tindalos. So it's a great story written in 1929, and the drug is a drug that was used by the Taoists, by Lao Tzu and others, in order to connect directly with the Tao, which is like such a 60s topic, and yet written in 1929. So you can already see the way that this material is starting to not just offer a kind of exotic trip of the imagination, but help to put together pieces that create the esoteric psychedelic backdrop that a lot of people brought into their psychedelic experience. Of course, King of the Hill, H.P. Lovecraft. I don't have any of the early Lancers, which are the most important or the really significant ones in the early 60s. This is the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Not as popular as the more well-known, really more dark Cthulhu stories, so to speak, but still a very profound work and a very deep dream zone. There were some stories of drugs in this weird fiction category. Here's a 1973 collection, Strange Ecstasies, which captures some of those, Arthur Machen, Clark Ashton Smith, et cetera. But mostly it was less about the actual use of drugs in these stories, many of which were drawn from a 19th century topos associated with hashish and exoticism. So there's really a current there between 19th century drug writing and weird fiction. But much more important was the exoticism and the flavor and the kind of the evocative landscapes of these books and stories. No discussion of this would be complete without a mention of the Ballantine adult fantasy series edited by Lynn Carter. This is the most important of this material within that period of time. This is a particularly delicious cover of my favorite Clark Ashton Smith collection, Zothique. So it really, you get a good sense of like, okay, you're 19 years old, you're stoned in your dorm room, there's a lot going on. This is, this is good TV. There's another bit though from a Clark Ashton story that is a drug story called A Vintage of Atlantis. And I just want to read a short portion, just again, to get the sense of how even purely fantastic cultural materials could be sort of encouraging or almost giving you tips or shapes of how to yourself enjoy or enter into a psychoactive experience. So what happens in this one is all these drunken pirates are drinking this wine from old Atlantean casks, and they're clearly going crazy, and the narrator's not having any, and then they force it down his gullet. The air about me seemed to brighten with the redness of ghostly blood that was everywhere, a light that came not from the fire nor from the nocturnal heavens. I beheld the faces and forms of the drinkers standing without shadow, as if mantled with a rosy phosphorescence. Rings a bell. And beyond them, where they stared in troubled and restless wonder, the darkness was illumined with a strange light. And then he proceeds to have many mad and unholy visions. So there's this interesting intensity within weird fiction where you approach the supernatural, but it's the unholy, and it's precisely the unholy or demonic or daemonic element of it that charges the exoticism of the fantasy. This is absolutely central to the state of the imagination or visionary literature or speculative literature at this point in history. And so as people go into psychedelic experiences, drawing from the cultural materials that shape the imagination, there's inevitably a space opened up for dark psychedelia. I cannot keep going without showing my favorite Frank Frazetta cover for Conan the Barbarian. And while Conan, the famous character of Robert E. Howard, friend of Lovecraft and whatever, and now Conan himself didn't like the supernatural, so he's always avoiding the supernatural in the stories. Occasionally he finds these spaces of alien architectures or strange kind of dark fantasy elements that really bring that forward. My final introduction to the sort of landscape that would shape dark psychedelia, moving away from the fantasy zone, is of course the writings of Philip K. Dick. Now, the paradox is Philip K. Dick did not actually take psychedelics very much. He did have a few very significant trips pretty early on. I think the first one was 1964. So he was avant-garde, maybe 1965. It was a nightmare trip, actually, appropriately. But so were his books. And so one feature of the sort of dark psychedelia was also the kind of, forgive the phrase, mindfuck dimension of science fiction that was going towards the mad or pathological. Also well captured by the following two covers, though they were admittedly from a later period. This is from 1978. There's the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Yeah, like you want to meet that guy in your trip. And this one does involve drugs. In fact, you take a drug and this guy's, you're inside his universe and you can't get out anymore. So, not exactly the contemporary story of psychedelics are going to heal everything and we're going to be connected and you'll face PTSD and we'll all be able to build a better world. Well, maybe. A Scanner Darkly is Dick's other major, there's a few there's a lot of drug novels now that I think about it, but this is the other really deep and dark drug culture one with an amazing cover by the legendary Bob Pepper, really one of my favorite pulp paperback covers there. So all to say, this is in the air. People are reading this stuff. It's popular. It's fun. It's like comic books, except a little bit later, a little bit older, a little bit darker, a little bit more adult, a little bit sexier. And that this really does have a big influence on the shape and culture of the psychedelic culture that's emerging in the 60s and 1970s. So thanks for that indulgence of letting me go through my collection here. And I think we're going to move on now to Amy Hale.
Okay. I loved those covers. They were so great. All right, I'm going to just throw this up here a minute. All right. Whoop. No, there we are. Great. Okay. So this is a really new area for me, and I am so glad to be here. And I have to say that I have had an absolute blast putting some of this material together. So I have a lot of quotes, so I wrote it down. So we'll just go from there. Okay. And these are musings on the dark feminine psychedelic, kind of an intro to what'll probably be a much wider conversation. In Psychedelic White, Aaron Saldana characterizes the normative story of the counterculture psychedelic experience as being most typically that of a man, a white man, undergoing a deep transformative experience, often or ideally facilitated in some way by a cultural other. People from exotic, read non-white or indigenous or possibly alien cultures, and women serve as agents of change for our hero because they possess the earthly or otherworldly essence that the man is trying to somehow integrate into his development. If women feature at all, they support or facilitate men's journeys as nurses, mothers, lovers, demons, or goddesses. As Maria Vittoria Mangini commented in a 2019 report for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which we more commonly known as MAPS, women's stories are rarely featured, especially those covering the themes of personal development and discovery. In fact, current attempts to highlight women's contributions to psychedelic culture and the emergent psychedelic industry are primarily focused on healing and wellness, narratives of achieving wholeness and overcoming trauma, rather than questing for enlightenment. How do we characterize women's stories of psychedelic engagement? And can a symbolic feminist reading of the psychedelic experience have the potential to disrupt the male-centered narrative, often structured as a Joseph Campbell-flavored heroic journey? Since it seems that we don't even have a template for the psychedelic feminine from a subjective perspective, how then can we define a dark psychedelic feminine? Or do these ideas even sit in distinction to each other? Is a feminist psychedelic potentially darker because of how we culturally perceive stories about women's mythic transformation and agency? The examples I'm looking at today in the work of Marjorie Cameron and Tai Shani emphasize the chthonic, underworld initiations, and the boundary-shattering ability of the witch. We will see the monstrous and the permeability of the body as both the experience and objective of psychedelically induced union, creating imaginative spaces for speculative social transformation. These imaginative spaces, inhabited by the fluidity of feminine excess and unboundedness, transcend the confines of language, making way for visions for new types of social relations. In Kim Hewitt's 2019 Psychedelic Feminism, a radical interpretation of psychedelic consciousness, she argues that psychedelic experience, regardless of gendered participant, is essentially feminine in nature. She comments, the symbolic feminine encompasses what has been excised as unnecessary, a threat or excess, irrationality, the unconscious, emotion, imagination, play, mystery, and pleasure without purpose or closure. Feminine discourse is similar to the Bakhtinian carnivalesque that subverts the established order and revels in the messiness of the grotesque body that is always in flux and cannot be contained. In relation to the psychedelic experience itself, Hewitt states, psychedelic experiences offer infinite possibilities for libidinous fusion with other humans, nature, spirits, ancestors, and the cosmos. Altered states of consciousness challenge our culturally concepted concepts of the body, individuality, gender, time, and every other bounded category structured by linear human thought. Discussions of consciousness, like the body, is always mediated by text and yet cannot be contained by it. A foray into expanded consciousness is a plunge into the realm of the symbolic feminine, which will always be in excess of language. We actually don't know nearly enough about the mind and psychedelic processes of the artist Marjorie Cameron, who's better known simply as Cameron, but we do know that she was nothing if not excessive. Her magical vision was in many ways more radical than that of her rather infamous, more magical husband, Jack Parsons. However, she's often dismissed as mentally unstable, and her contributions to occult history are culturally marginalized, with Parsons taking more than his share of the spotlight, despite her impact on the art scene of the mid-20th century Los Angeles. It strikes me that we can productively talk about the interconnectedness of art, psychedelics, and magic in Cameron's work as vehicles for traversing boundaries and creating new realities. Clearly, there was an intersection between drugs and Aleister Crowley, the libertarian and libertine Thelema, which fueled the ritual activities of Parsons and later Cameron, and the emergent philosophies of psychedelic enlightenment in Los Angeles in the early 1950s. Altered states and the permeability of consciousness were central to Cameron's experience. After Parsons' death in 1952, Cameron moved to the desert, where over the next year, she briefly pulled together a magical, racially diverse group called the Children, engaging in group sex magic designed to create a new progressive race of moon children, harkening back to Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard's attempt to create a moon child in the 1946 Babylon working. But Cameron's vision did not just stop at a single incarnation. She had a bigger vision in mind. This was a magical mission of a radical societal transformation, advancing humanity through the creation of a multiracial polyamorous society. And it has always fascinated me that this rather edgy and illegal for the time set of rituals seems to have escaped wider commentary in occult lore. And I'm just showing you some pictures for set and setting. Ostensibly inspired by a 1953 lecture by consciousness pioneer Gerald Heard, Cameron embraced peyote and mushrooms as part of her magical, artistic, and ritual work. Another account mentions her attending an Aldous Huxley lecture in 1954, which may also be true. We know that psychedelics inspired some of her later paintings, such as this one, this series from the 1970s, the Lion Path series. Cameron's art features beautiful, dark, otherworldly visions and processes of transformation. Her scandalous and censored drawing Peyote Vision from 1954 and 1955 shows a figure in sexual congress with its pieces, the penetration and mingling of bodies, transgression as an integral way of knowing, the becoming of an ecstatic and grotesque body, human-animal hybrids, angels, and witches, who, as we shall see, form a central figure in our understanding of the dark feminine psychedelic. The witch not only transverses boundaries, she's a liberatory figure. Initiation and transfiguration are also important themes in Cameron's work, but these tend not to be moving toward a shining transcendent conclusion, but more toward the exploration of the deep interior shadows. Cameron's poem, Cinderella of the Wastelands, featured in Curtis Harrington's 1956 film, Wormwood Star, describes an Eleusinian-style descent to the underworld. Her 1964 poem, Black Pilgrimage, echoes dark themes of a traveler undergoing change and initiation, illustrated with hybridized twisted figures and possibly her own blood. Cameron's work is often characterized by scholars and other occultists as being in response to her own grief after the death of Parsons, but I want to ask if it's always necessary to center Parsons in our analysis of Cameron's work. We know much more about the psychedelic vision of Turner Award-winning artist Ty Shani, which has some interesting thematic overlaps with that of Cameron. Shani is explicitly working toward developing the visual language and mythos of an occulted feminist psychedelic vernacular. Her current exploration, Neon Hieroglyph, is a series of projects emerging from 9 fragmentary stories, retelling the mythologies around ergot as a psychedelic catalyst. For Shani, ergot evokes a different feminist history of psychedelics. Unlike ayahuasca or peyote, the consumption of ergot is not typically linked with ritual or initiation, and it happens by accident more than design. The conventional use of ergot is discussed within the history of women's health as an abortifactant and a migraine treatment. Its unofficial outcomes, however, are linked to stories of witches, astral travel, demons, and the communal folding of reality, which are some of the themes of Shani's work. So in this segment of the Neon Hieroglyph, Shani refers to the kykeon ingested during the Eleusinian mysteries, said to have been seeded by ergot on barley as the facilitator of initiatory rites concerning Persephone's descent. Down Rarian fields, ellipses, carnivores, swanskin, and poplin, consume spoiled grains, fatally atrophies in muted purple the useful limbs, and tessellates fractals that bridge into worlds unknown where our grasp on a telepathic interdependent language is sensual. Another legendary inspiration of the series comes from the Italian island of Alicudi, where women were said to have baked ergot-laden bread, and the whole island was tripping for 450 years. This bread is a placebo. The bread is a spaceship. In the electronic rush of a constant beat, we hear a constant horizon. We see in the constant horizon a mausoleum for the psychedelic witches. We paint our bodies with the oleander oil, like Persephone painted all the flowers of the world. We make circles of salt. We fly to the sleepy Calabrian towns to steal from the rich. We kiss with venomous serpents. We spell for revolution. We invoke the angels that course wildly in the elements. Shani's ideal psychedelic figure is not the enlightenment-seeking hero. She is actually the witch. She told me, the figure of the witch is a psychedelic one. The witch represents a threshold between the natural and the supernatural, between the material and metaphysical, like acid, ergot, mescaline, etc. The witch is an agent that has both a material and an immaterial life, a threshold between two realms. The witch is also the vessel that contains the changing attitudes to excess, from her porosity to the divine, which becomes her permeability to evil. The witch is the human embodiment of chaotic wickedness and dark powers, and powerful she is, but she is also a wrecker of civilization and morality. Shani is also interested in the ways in which psychedelic spaces can drive new visions of society. Her excessive Italian witch is also a Robin Hood figure who, while flying through the air, redistributes food to people in need. She says, that sense of collectivity was the main thing I wanted to explore, and ergot seemed like a very interesting conduit for me to address how the more metaphysical questions, or the immaterial mysticism, or the fantastical dimensions of our lived experience or culture might be put to use in a more direct socialist materialist way. But this is not a hippie vision drawing on the aesthetics of an idealized anti-modern past. Both Cranman with her moon children and Shani engage with more than a touch of the speculative future. Psychedelics can provide an imaginative space not bounded by language, where new futures can emerge, where women can be something else. Mirroring Kim Hewitt's conception of a feminist psychedelic, Shani comments, the psychedelic as an experience is one of ontological excess. Feminine excess is contingent on the conditions of gender within the social sphere, but that socially produced excess is also experienced ontologically. Feminist discourse introduces methodologies that are horizontal, non-hierarchical, visceral, or psychic, or physical. Experiences of this approach are also psychedelic. Thus, feminine excess characterizes the experiences we have no words for, allowing us to literally envision new futures outside the boundaries of language. We are phytoplankton, greenly synthesized into photosensitive green life givers. We would be eternally green communists, eternally horizontal, eternally porous, eternally communing to our collaborative, compose the epic unsung anthem of the unbroken cycle of our interdependency, a fragile ecology in the powerful movements of astral dust. I don't think the dark psychedelic feminine is explicitly sinister, but it is definitely transgressive, excessive, and heralded by witches. It's fleshy, it bleeds and oozes, merges and spills over, envisioning futures we as yet have no names for, generated in a space that lies beyond words, ultimately envisioned as a radical undoing. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thanks, Amy. You know, what we want to do here is just invite some of the fellow panelists to lean in here if there's anything they want to say, just to keep it a little more loose than a strict panel format. One thing that I was thinking about, you know, and for some reason I can't believe in preparing this roundtable, I hadn't even really thought about it, is I love Shani's emphasis on ergot, not just because of the particular history of ergot, but the gesture of reaching towards a psychoactive ally that is not already credited with a whole set of cultural assumptions and narratives around it. And that's a very powerful act. And indeed, there's lots of these allies lurking on the boundaries of the more conventionally listed, you know, major psychedelics. And ergot is one, but there's a whole family that we haven't, I just feel like I'm obliged by our topic to bring up, which is the nightshades. Because, you know, like most people, even hardcore psychonauts are not like, you know, chomping at the bit to take Datura. But of course, Datura is not only an incredibly powerful psychoactive and part of this larger family of psychoactive nightshades, which includes scopolamine and other kind of compounds and a variety of plants, but it's also profoundly central to the indigenous people of my region, where I live, in the West Coast, where that is the psychedelic. So for a lot of indigenous cultures, the psychedelic was not ayahuasca or mushrooms. It was one of these nightshades, which tend to be, well, nightshady, witchier. So
well, Dator is also, of course, linked with stories of witches.
Absolutely, and probably for good reason. So it's interesting to even think about part of the way that and this, like, the question for you is like how our mapping of this space also involves a particular way of characterizing the relationship to the compound in question, like the way, very much the way that Shawnee is very selective about ergot.
She is, and it's the thing that's been so interesting to me as I look through the different themes that have emerged in not just these two women's work, but also in kind of looking at really ritual and mythology of particularly women from, I'd say, late 19th century, kind of, from Jane Harrison work onwards, how we start coming up with that and how this intersects with ideas of the psychedelic when we're talking about that kind of how to use those for transformation. What does that sort of transformation look like for women? What I think is fascinating about what Shawnee's doing is that it's not so much that it doesn't have histories or stories, because she's deliberately, in each of her 9 sections, she is drawing on a rich mythology having to do with ergot. But what she's saying is that it's more, what she's trying to present is the idea of an imagined communal history, rather than one person, except for the Eleusinian mysteries, but she still situates that within a community of people going through initiation. So she's really trying to take this not as I'm taking this in order to have my valiant experience, but this is a thing that a whole bunch of us take or have taken or have experienced, maybe by accident, but it increases our sense of communing with the other and with history, and where time becomes boundless, and where people as individuals become boundless. And I think that's really a key part to her work, that she is trying to link in with this mythical history of ergot, which is a really fascinating vision.
May I jump in here, Eric?
Yeah, please.
Amy, thank you so much. That presentation, I had so many eyes going off. It was awesome. I really, really enjoyed it. So thanks again. I'm curious about something. Perhaps you can shed light on the way in which certain substances are personified. Like I've heard of Mother Ayahuasca. I haven't heard it called Father Ayahuasca. I've heard of cannabis being referred to as a woman. However, I never hear that with LSD or DMT. Have you been able to determine what it is and how these cultural constructs are projected on substances?
I actually have no idea. But one of the things that in expanding this, that I really want to look into is where women sit in psychedelic culture between kind of the subject and the object. And so if any of you know about specific studies, I know that there have been a couple very brief pieces that have been done about women in the 60s and their perception kind of culturally of their own othering. And I wonder if maybe part of that isn't a projection about women as goddess, women as where the drug becomes an embodiment of the woman who is supposed to lead you on this particular journey.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And it's, of course, it's wrapped up in larger cultural complexes, such as, oh, this is organic and therefore woman. So it comes from the earth, therefore it's a woman. Oh, this was cooked up in a lab, therefore masculine. I mean, yes, seemingly extraordinarily arbitrary, but it's a curious complex.
Yeah. It's worth noting one fact, which is that in contemporary global ayahuasca culture, ayahuasca is, generally referred to, if they're going to gender at all, as mother or grandmother, and even to the sense of grandmother told me X or whatever. But if you go to the Amazon and you look at individual stories, myths, languages, images coming out of particular indigenous groups and even some mestizo groups, it's the opposite. That ayahuasca is associated with hunting. It's a male mystery, not that only males do it, and there are widely varying ways that it is consumed. Some of them are very collective and celebrational. They're standing up and dancing. Some of them are like not dissimilar from the format that are familiar with in global ayahuasca culture. But the sort of construction of ayahuasca as feminine is not entirely a global phenomenon, but it has a lot more to say about the global situation than it does even about the originary contexts, which are of course multiple and variant because it's such a wide and complex and rich area. But I think maybe it's a good time to move on. We're going to go continuing into the dark. I think I want to come back to some of this question about the sinister, because I feel like that's the comment about the sinister is not essential to the dark psychedelic feminine, but I'm like, let's play a little bit more there, but I think we need some more data. So let's go with James Riley.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Amy, for a wonderful talk. Lots to say about that. I too had lots of points that we can come back to, and of course, thank you, Eric, for putting this together. Great to be here with Christian, and thanks everyone for coming. Can everyone see that image there? Is that okay? All right, okay, fine. So my contribution to tonight, I'm going to be talking, or today actually, it's tonight here, but it's nice and early for everybody else. But my contribution is I'm going to talk about a short film called The Virgin Sacrifice. And I'm going to hopefully draw a few ideas out of this. Now, The Virgin Sacrifice is a short film allegedly made in 1969 by the mysterious and reclusive director J.X. Williams. And it begins with two roommates, there we are. Begins with two roommates, Nikki and Dawn, who try to convince a third, Cindy, to join them in that most fashionable of late 1960s activities, devil worship. The cult believes that the evil in this world far outweighs the good, and so we believe that Satan is our true savior, explains Dawn, before Nikki adds, it's the in thing to do. Fade to black, and then we cut to shots of a deep, dark stairway. We begin to hear drone music, and we begin to see weird rituals, and all this plays out on crackling, sulfurous film. All kinds of psychedelic imagery flashes across the screen, and suddenly we see a shot of the horizon, and a dark figure appears who walks towards the sunlight. It's not exactly clear at this point what has become of Cindy. And the Virgin Sacrifice, according to its own internal story and its own internal history, was originally intended as part of a longer 3-hour film funded by a member of the Church of Satan. The production was beset by problems. Cast members overdosed. Williams was the victim of a car bombing. The film negative disappeared and the processing lab burnt down. Writing in his as yet unpublished autobiography, The Big Footnote, Williams claims that his previous film, Incubus, was made in equally ominous circumstances. Among other mishaps, the production company went belly up, and in a sign of bad things to come, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate attended the premiere. Only 9 minutes of The Virgin Sacrifice are known to have survived, and Williams has little good to say about it. According to his archivist, the curator and video artist Noel Lawrence, Williams came to regard The Virgin Sacrifice as cursed. Where Incubus was shadowed by coincidental mishaps, the chaos of The Virgin Sacrifice was, according to Williams, of a wholly different order. You could just smell the vapor of evil clouding the set. At least that's the story. The Virgin Sacrifice is about the length of Kenneth Anger's Invocation of My Demon Brother, and its intense hypnotic images similarly give the impression that as you watch the film and as it plays out, some kind of spell is being cast. Invocation, though, is utterly distinctive, with the film's color scheme, imagery, and editing style bearing Anger's artistic signature throughout. By contrast, a closer look at The Virgin Sacrifice indicates that this obscure, allegedly unseen film consists entirely of clips taken from other, more readily available films, particularly David Durston's I Drink Your Blood from 1970 and Lucio Fulci's Lizard in a Woman's Skin from 1971, to name two. The meeting between Nikki, Dawn, and Cindy also comes from Devil's Due from 1973, a pornographic film directed by Ernest Dana. The Virgin Sacrifice came into public view via the DVD Experiments in Terror in 2003, a collection of short films curated by Noel Lawrence, which offers a further wink that this reliquary of the late 1960s might not be all that it seems. As a fragment of a vanished film, one that might have never existed at all, there's nothing certain about The Virgin Sacrifice, least of all its director, J.X. Williams, who may well be an invention of Noel Lawrence or vice versa. Within the smoke and mirrors that surrounds the film, the best we can say is that The Virgin Sacrifice is a contemporary short designed to look as if it was made in 1969. Now, I'm offering this example to today's discussion of dark psychedelia for two reasons. Number one, in my view, The Virgin Sacrifice self-consciously works with and invokes a complex set of associations that have come to define a particular narrative of the 60s and 1969 specifically. And number two, and I think more specifically for today, the film crystallizes a resonant subgenre within psychedelic cinema and within the wider 60s narrative alluded to, which we might term acid horror. As regards the first point, that Williams or Lawrence or whoever refers to Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate when sketching out the film's history, suggests that he's keen to weave The Virgin Sacrifice into the aura of Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, and by extension, the other silent name here, Charles Manson. Indeed, The Virgin Sacrifice evokes not only the allegedly cursed atmosphere of Rosemary's Baby, stories of which were amplified in the aftermath of the Manson murders, but also the many rumors of secret, lost, if not infernal films linked to the Manson family and also the Polanski circle. In turn, such overdetermined ideas of Hollywood, celebrity, and occult conspiracy come connotatively into view. When combined, these fields invoke the enduring narrative of the late 1960s as a period of catastrophic decline, the shift from a positive day-glow optimism towards a generalized dark side and an atmosphere of what Hunter S. Thompson called bad craziness. In keeping with this milieu, a matrix which ultimately further embellishes the 60s as an exceptional decade, The Virgin Sacrifice blends typical psychedelic imagery, intense color, information overload, an atmosphere of visionary experience with a particular sensibility of horror, one which pertains to the possibility of dissolution, negation, or some other form of extreme derangement of the senses. There's my own little light show going off there. Now then, I offer this mode here briefly as acid horror to suggest that The Virgin Sacrifice is not a film about psychedelic drugs per se, but one which employs the visual style associated with their use to depict an ambiguous psychic state, a strange and powerful encounter with that which comes through the door, as it were. Similar imagery can be found in late 1960s Lovecraft cinema, such as Vernon Sewell's Curse of the Crimson Altar from 1968, and Daniel Haller's The Dunwich Horror from 1970. What these films have in common is a disturbing sense of communion, experiences felt by their protagonists, which are not hallucinatory so much as darkly epiphanic. Collectively, they remind us that there is something horrific at the heart of the psychedelic experience. And Aldous Huxley felt as much after his first use of LSD in 1955. He believed the drug had opened his mind to an immense and almost unbearable sense of overwhelm, what he called the clear light. For Huxley, those who come back from such experiences are never quite the same as those who went out. The Virgin Sacrifice draws heavily on this provocation. Along with these prior works, it suggests that our minds and our bodies are not our own. We are always already the void, the open door, through which something can easily step in, and, as Lovecraft might warn us, something can step out. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, James. That was wonderful. I've met Noel, and we've hung out a bit, and I just the whole project is really wonderful, and it kind of leads, I guess, to a question, which is maybe is broader than the topic of dark psychedelia, but seems related in certain ways, because visual imagery film is such an important way that we have circulated or mediated aspects of psychedelic experience. But the question is, there seems to be something in the filmic imagination of the film that is not seen, and the imagination of this film that is beyond the archive, an impossible film, or an absolutely forbidden film. And obviously some of those films are associated with the, with, if there is evil, the evil things that people do, but not entirely. So there's something, I'd like you to riff a little bit more on this film that is not a film, or a fragment of a film that was never made, and something about that revealed, concealed, unseen, seen dynamic as it talks about sort of dark cinematic visions.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's a brilliant question, and you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of what I think the Virgin Sacrifice, and what I also think Noel Lawrence is getting at as an artist, and he's sort of choosing, I think, this sort of deeply resonant imagery and material to get at this. And I think that's the key element here, the materiality of film and its potentialities, and the way in which you have this substance, this photochemical substance, which is able to render and make manifest color and image, trap it in some way. The thinking of its mechanism very easily, I think, pertains to and invites a consideration of the magical and the sorceress. It is the means and the matter by which one can project the will and to make it manifest. And certainly that's the way that Kenneth Anger thought of the filmmaking process, as this sorceress process whereby he was actually able to make manifest the latent and to bring this kind of visionary into a material form, and along with all the ability to manipulate time, generate something that wasn't there in the first instance through the simplest juxtaposition and editing. If you think about Eisenstein's lions, for example, jumping into life and disgust, we have that all the way through the history of montage. But I think also that pertains to the additional elements of your question, that there is this subgenre, and almost, if you like, subcategory of thinking about the fascination of the lost films. It's almost as if it's not quite enough. It's almost as if the magical powers of film itself are not quite enough to satisfy and to satiate the desire for an other. There's something else there, that somehow the materialization of thought, the materialization of fantasy pushes that desire further. And I think then we have this trope, if you like, of the lost film or the hidden film, which one sees in a variety of different milieu, but it also comes together in this particular form and this particular cultural moment, with rumors of Kenneth Anger's hidden films, buried films, which is what causes Bobby Beausoleil to move into the Manson circle, and the murders that Charles Manson was connected to. They're so terrible, but there must be even worse film material out somewhere, possibly buried in the desert. And I think where that's where film becomes seen as a part of evidence, which then pertains to the conspiratorial, which is about the presumption of a narrative which is going to be clearer, more explicatory, more revealing, but it's always somewhere else. It's always the next narrative level up. So I think what we've got in this kind of circle and this milieu is those two different lines of association converging. A magical understanding of film and filmmaking, but also the way in which at this historical moment it pertains to the conspiratorial.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. You know, there's more we can riff on, but because you've been talking about Manson, it sets up what Christian is going to do. And I'm with my eye on the clock. I also see it's running through us. So why don't we move on to Christian, then we'll have a bit more time at the end. Thanks so much, James.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great, and can everyone see this? Yes? Great. First, I just want to start by saying how much of an honor it is to be on this panel. James, Amy, Eric, I have read and loved your books for so long, so thanks again for including me, because it really is a wonderful experience to be on a panel with my friends and to really talk about stuff that I will admit, first and foremost, is not my expertise. I'm much more committed to the hippy dippy light side, so to look at the dark side was a real treat. All right, so I will open with a date, 8/8/1988. In the Bay Area of San Francisco, on this date, a mass rally was staged in honor of Charles Manson. August 8th, 1988 is important as it marked the 19th anniversary of the Folgers Tate LaBianca murder spree, conducted by Manson's acid fellowship, The Family, in 1969. Now, there's three other elements at play in the 8/8/88 ceremony. H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. 88 is code amongst neo-Nazis for Hail Hitler. Another element, August 8th is also the day that the atomic bomb was dropped over Nagasaki, an apocalyptic event. Also, according to legend, the date coincided with a significant ritual conducted by Anton LaVey, head of the Church of Satan, some years before. Also, I've just learned that it is also the anniversary of the first conclave of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, all of this is to say, we have an admixture here in this event. Manson worship, neo-Nazism, Satanism, and the apocalypse. All of these elements come together to animate this event, which we see here on the image. We have the flyer for it. That's right. So the 8/8/88 event, in my view, represents, for historians, a convenient reference point, a landmark for historicizing the reception history of Charles Manson as the folk hero for dark psychedelicism. All right, let's look a bit deeper at this event. Oops, there we are. So, playing to a packed house, the 8/8/88 Manson ritual was a cause célèbre in the underground and corporate media. Why? Not least because Geraldo Rivera, the investigative schlockmeister himself, was on hand to film the proceedings, which were aired as part of his famously sensationalized TV expose on the Satanic Underground. Here we have two stills from that particular television event, as I like to say, Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground. And on the right, you'll see the Strand Theater, where the event actually took place. All right, let's move a little bit deeper into this darkness. Bonk. The event itself was staged by what has been called the Feral House Abraxas clique. Here we see the guiding lights of that particular clique. Now, this group was a cabal or a clique of influential artists, musicians, provocateurs, and hipsters. And really, their coming together to stage this rally marked a high watermark for the dark psychedelicist thread. And this thread continues to gain momentum up to the present day. That said, of course, its roots lie in the 1960s. And as much as it may pain psychedelic advocates and even scholars sympathetic to psychedelicism, even as it may pain them to admit, conservative ideologues like Richard Nixon, as well as liberal commentators like Joan Didion, were partially right. The Manson murders were a direct reflection of the hippie thing. Bonk. Now, okay, don't freak out. I know this is a complicated slide. I just want to draw your attention to one thing. Here we see a spectrum where I've graphed 60s psychedelic militancy. And I would just like to mention that the reductive analysis of Nixon and Didion reflects something that is true, that Manson's emphasis on murder as a sacred act, well, that was just another modality on a spectrum. In fact, I just want to draw your attention to Timothy Leary's POW statement issued in 1970, in which he states, to shoot a policeman in defense of life is a sacred act. Now here, all I'm trying to do is draw your attention to the fact that Leary himself would associate holiness and violence. Leary often being represented as Mr. Peace and Love. So here we have a reflection of Leary and Manson. Okay, now to be sure, a portion of 60s psychedelic militants, the freaks, regarded the Manson family as fellow travelers. As these underground press clippings make clear, on the left we have Tuesday's Child, the right we have New Times, some freaks, that is to say psychedelic militants, recognize their own persecution by the corporate media, by law enforcement and the courts in the trial of Charles Manson. On the left, Tuesday Child, fantastic rag out of LA, very occult. And on the cover, as you see, it says Charles Manson is Man of the Year. Wow, a pretty bold statement. On the right, we're going to see the New Times cover. And if you look there, the little headline says, the media assassination of Charles Manson. Okay, now let's go to a different group of freaks that would valorize Manson. This group, much more militant than the underground press, would hail the assassination, the murder of glamorous Hollywood actress Shannon Tate and the heiress of the Folgers' fortune, Abigail Folger, as an important, though totally symbolic blow against the American imperium, America spelled with 3 Ks. This line of thought could be associated with Jerry Rubin, who famously quipped, until you're prepared to kill your parents, you're not really prepared to change the country. Again, working on the symbolic level, freaks like Rubin would recognize the murder of Folger and Tate LaBianca and others as in many ways a reflection of the violence that goes on every day in the streets of America, as well as in America's colonial exploits. Finally, there were still other heads sympathetic. Well, if not sympathetic, we can look at R. Crumb, who sketched that funny little image there, who were satisfied with, if not condemning Manson, well, then at least they were satisfied lampooning the media spectacle of the Manson murders as simply another and no less outrageous aspect of a world gone completely mad. Here, I'd just like to point your attention to the Crumb, and I think this is less of a remark on Crumb and the so-called family, the Manson family, as it is the media spectacle that grew up around it. Okay, now just to be clear, sympathy for Manson amongst acid militants shifted dramatically as the full creepy details of Helter Skelter came to light during the trial, which lasted until the early 1970s. However, this waning of interest just made room for the next generation of hip militants, the punks. Well, the punks shading into the death rock scene of LA, shading into the industrial subculture. Well, here we see a marked affinity for Manson's image, much in the same fashion as there was a marked affinity for the swastika. Not so much as ideology, not so much as an endorsement of the particular ideas associated with the swastika mentioned, but really as a means of shocking the bourgeois, of upsetting the order, what in the 1950s hipsters called capping the squares. That said, it's important to note the emergence of a hard line subcurrent of race hatred within the punk death rock / industrial subcultures, specifically in Southern California and parts of the UK associated with the skinhead subculture. So that's a sub-thread within this sub-thread. Okay. The 1980s saw a resurgence of Manson mania as part of the larger underground publishing boom centered in fanzines, which I treat at length in my forthcoming book, Angel-Headed Hipsters. So here, Feral House Press, the Feral House Abraxas clique, they led the way in 1980s Manson mania by producing a steady stream of dark psychedelicist and Mansonic literature. Now, if anyone here is a collector, you no doubt have copies of Apocalypse Culture, maybe even its sequel, Apocalypse Culture 2, and maybe even its sequel, Cult Rapture. It is hard to overemphasize the influence that Feral House and its publisher, Adam Parfrey, had in the fanzine culture. In fact, it spawned numerous imitators, which would continue to churn out this dark pulp, I think, in a significantly decreasing quality, really up into the present. Speaking of which, if we just want to dip our toe into the 1990s, let me just say one name, Marilyn Manson. Okay, so the Manson thing continues. Of course, oftentimes the use of Manson is a reflection on the media spectacle and the subcultural appropriation, very rarely actually having to do with this particular figure and those around him. So I'm going to conclude this lecture with one more spectrum. Again, it's a little busy, but don't get worried. I just want to talk to you about one part of the spectrum, and that's acid militancy in the 1980s. Here we see similar graph, psychedelic militancy on a spectrum. On the left, we have pacifists or Groucho Marxists. On the right, we have satanic fascists. The takeaway here from this presentation is that Feral House's Manson worship, the 8888 event, was part of the same milieu as more recognizable psychedelicist groups of the 80s, like the Church of the Subgenius or Discordianism. All of these groups, keep this in mind, this is the important part, all of them adopted a militant and indeed apocalyptically violent, if only on a symbolic level, posture toward normal society, normals. Okay, in conclusion, as I hope to have shown, the Manson family and its recuperation by successive generations of acid militants can neither be marginalized nor ignored in the study of acid culture or modern esotericism in general. And boop, this is my information, Hip Reception of Charles Manson. Feel free to send me an Instagram message. Thanks a lot for your attention, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Christian. I guess thank you. Grim stuff. And really important to think about in terms of, a lot of stuff on our mind today about the commingling of new forms of irrationalism and conspiracy and race hatred and American legacy. And it's really important to recognize that the underground, the psychedelic underground, the counterculture is part of this milieu, part of this stew. But of course, things are also getting constantly reorganized. And I guess the question I have for you, and I actually kind of want to open this up for everybody. This is kind of my general, this problem, which is that you have a spectrum where there's, dallying with the dark, maybe actually sort of embracing things for a subversive function. And then there's at a certain point where you're like, okay, now we're in the sinister. Now we're in something that is cruel, unethical, evil, if you want to use supernatural language, but at the very least, very bad. And clearly that possibility fires up the rest of it. So you're as a cultural analyst, you're left with this really weird problem, which is like, I can draw a line and say, yeah, no, those are the bad guys over there. I could say, no way, Christian. The psychedelicists of the 80s, they were pranksters, but this stuff, that's different. You can't call that psychedelicist because I want to draw that line. On the other hand, once you kind of make it a spectrum, then like everybody gets sort of tainted. And that's part of the power of the gesture, is this flickering ambiguity of whether you have to include the truly sinister as part of what you're talking about, or whether you can safely just play on the edges of it. And that ambiguity seems to be part of the problem. So that's my problematic that I'd like to hear everybody respond to.
Well, Eric, if I could just say one thing, as a historian of fanzines, the smoking gun is the fact that they all appear in each other's magazines and books. I mean, Feral House published stuff by Subgenius, Hakim Bey, and vice versa. I mean, I was really surprised to see how much Charles Manson appeared in Subgenius literature, which is often paraded as the goofy spoof joke parody religion. But if you look at the material, it's full of apocalypse. It's full of violence, full of Manson, because it caps the squares. You know, fuck them if they can't take a joke. It's the same thing. It's about getting one over. And this is what makes it hard to study this particular material, dark psychedelicism, because even, I think Boyd Rice is the example. Impossible to peg him down.
Yeah.
Is this real? Are you really a fascist? Gotcha. And I think you see that move now recreated in the red pill phenomenon.
Yeah.
I know when I've been looking at that kind of spectrum applied to, you know, other forms of history, when we're talking about the power of free speech and the power of transgressive speech, the way that I'm looking at it now is that the context is just so wildly different. And so it's hard for me to, it's not like I'm excusing anybody in the past for doing the kinds of things that they did that might have led to some of the uglier social movements that we're seeing today. And it's not as though the roots of that social activity were not there. But I think that there's something that is so viscerally different for me in looking at what Feral House was trying to do in terms of publishing things that are just really gross, you know, and what the Subgenii were trying to do, publishing things that were just really gross to get a rise out of people, or even to have maybe some other impact of trying to get you to think differently, if we're taking it into kind of like a psychedelic realm of changing how we approach the world and universe. There's a big difference in doing that back then to posting something on the internet today, because you've got access to it. You know, back in the 1980s, finding writings by Charles Manson might have been a little bit more different, maybe a little bit transgressive, because it's not all out there. And so, you know, the context in which we experience those texts, I think has changed so wildly that when I look at what was Feral House trying to do, because I ask myself that question at least once a month, you know, what were they trying to do? The answer is it changes over time.
Especially between editions of Apocalypse Culture. As I said, I think everyone has a copy of that in their library. They probably have a second edition. The first edition of the first Apocalypse Culture was half about acid. And then they realized, that's not transgressive enough. Just put in eugenics. So that made me think, this was just schlock. This was just shock.
Huh.
I want to open it up though. Yeah.
Go ahead, Christian.
No,
Go
James,
ahead.
I insist. What?
No, James.
I'm just kind of accumulating points as people are talking, really, because, reflecting to your wonderful talk and Amy's points is that, I was struck by, yes, I think the context is shifting in terms of access and distribution and availability of information, but also the sheer rapidity through which Manson, in your talk, the sort of contemporary rapidity in which Manson seemed to emerge fully formed as a kind of cult figure. And I mean cult as in terms of a figure of a degree of appreciation, as opposed to him operating within a cult dynamic. He seemed to emerge as this kind of iconic figure very quickly in relation to the events. And although it moves through a series of different guises in the kind of map and the spectrum that you're pointing out, there's a peculiar and sort of very stubborn consistency in which Manson seems to be this point of gravitation, this kind of open kind of symbol, and he sort of never really changes. And it even to the point where there was a range of attention linked to Manson's death. It was the same kind of ideas that were coming out in the think pieces, the same kind of opinions that were coming out, the same kind of cultural representations of him. So it accumulates an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of response, but he remains strangely and stubbornly consistent. And what interests me about that is the velocity and the immediacy of that appearance so soon after the events is associated with. And I wonder if that also has something to do with the context, that proximity of things like Tuesday's Child, that the importance of a certain cultural moment in terms of the ability to create individuals and names as symbols.
I wonder too, though, if we have to address at a more basic level a gap between sort of a metaphoric figurative play and actuality, which gets fuzzy in people like Crowley, where you just don't really know. But certainly if we take, say, as two extremes on that line, Georges Bataille with his, excess, but it's all about metaphor. He's not really doing much of that. And Manson as the two extremes, do we have to kind of notice that one of them doesn't quite mean it?
Who would, can I respond to that?
Go right ahead.
Well, I think the role of metaphor in Bataille is kind of interesting. I think the thing that came to mind as you were talking is the way in which, Bataille is writing in the way that, metaphors kind of are collapsing into metonymies. They're lines of associations. So in Story of the Eye, they're these kind of lines of connections which are putting a sort of deferring meaning. And whether or not sort of Bataille is thinking about a metaphorical play and Manson is working in a slightly different way, I think Manson has become a kind of metonym. His name stands in for a wide range of ideas, and it's a kind of shorthand for lots of ideas. But in terms of his own play, did he actually mean it? I think a way of trying to understand Charles Manson and some of his phenomena is that sense of someone trying to work to keep a peculiar cult dynamic together, someone giving a very kind of heightened group what they want to hear. There was a kind of play is the wrong word because of the actual consequences and the implications that we're talking about here, but there was, I think, something of a performative element to the discourse within the family, which had something to do with a play of metaphor and a working with symbols and a gathering together of lots of very resonant material, which just sort of slightly fell short of adding up to something specific. It kept the group question. It kept that. It held back that offer of some kind of.
It's actually funny that you brought up the example of Bataille, because I would slightly push back on the total metaphoricity, because if you're going into the lore, the biographical lore, you go, okay, Asafal, were they really going to kill someone? So in a way, we have that snuff movie problem again in Bataille's story. And in fact, that we get to repeat a similar pattern with Bataille, where some people are like, okay, actually, maybe we need to draw the line here on this guy. Like, maybe this is a little much. Or is it real? Or is it just part of the scam? But it makes it a little bit more spicy. And it's just kind of almost funny that we almost have a very similar kind of pattern with that. But I want to, we have, Christian's got a question from Amy, and then we have a hand raised from Kay. So we'll get to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize how deeply I did not want this to be all about Manson. I am Mansoned out. So I have a question for Amy. What was dark psychedelicism before Manson? I think that is how I would like to phrase my thinking on the topic. Manson runs away with it as a spectacle, but how was Cameron styling darkness, not necessarily evil, but darkness in the pre-Manson period?
When I was really musing on when Eric kind of brought us together about what are the themes that we look at when we're talking about, either darkness, or when we're looking at how do we define the psychedelic, and do we want to define psychedelia as this thing which might involve drugs, but might involve something wider, which may include drug-induced states of transformation, and I tend to see that Cameron in particular, I'm thinking that, she merged all of these notions with an idea to transformation. And what I wanted to maybe what I wanted to hint at, which I kind of ask explicitly at the beginning when I'm looking at both of these artists, is if we don't really know how to talk about the feminine psychedelic experience, is there something about women's or things linked with the feminine, and I don't want to essentialize that, is there something about that kind of transformation that we already see as dark? Is it already marked, maybe not as sinister, but it's already marked as something which is dark? And in the longer version of this that I'm putting together, I actually start with a quote from Ethel Colquhoun from her Living Stones in 1957, where she talks about Keef not as hash, but as the state that hash creates. And she talks about, she has this quote in the Living Stones of, why is it that state tends to be reserved for men? Why is it that women can't do this? Because I need to get to that state in order to be creative. And is it because we're afraid of women's contemplation? Is there something about women's interiority that society wants to restrict because women have to be on display, because women have to be extroverted? So the question that I'm asking, because yes, there are some things that I think come up really interestingly in both of the artists that I'm looking at, but I think the darkness is, it might be characterized by the things about women that everybody finds scary. And that's kind of what I'm looking at. Was Cameron doing that intentionally? Was she saying, "Ooh, I'm going to be spooky"? I mean, she kind of just was that way because she was doing her own thing. But that's the box we're putting her in.
Great. Hey, I want to let Kay ask a question now. You're welcome to unmute. I think you should